They called them Maruta. The word is Japanese. It means logs, not patients, not prisoners, not people. Logs. Because logs are things you use, things you study, things you discard when you are finished with them. Between 1932 and 1945, in a remote corner of Japanese-occupied China, a secret military unit operated a facility that was officially described as a water purification plant. It was the largest biological warfare complex ever constructed. It covered 6 square kilometers. It had its own railway line, its own power station, its own airstrip. And inside it, 3,000 Japanese researchers, doctors, scientists, military officers performed experiments on living human beings so extreme that when the truth finally emerged, even the prosecutors at Nuremberg could barely bring themselves to describe them. There were no documented survivors from inside the camp, not one. This is Unit 731, the darkest laboratory in human history. And the story does not end with Japan's defeat. It ends with a deal. To understand Unit 731, you have to understand the man who created it. Shiro Ishii was born in 1892 in a small farming village in Japan. From childhood, it was clear he was exceptional, brilliant, driven, with a memory that seemed almost supernatural. He could absorb entire medical textbooks overnight. He graduated at the top of his class. He rose through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army's medical division with a speed that astonished his peers. But there was something else underneath the brilliance. Ishii was highly intelligent but arrogant, merciless, and immoral. He thought of himself as beyond reproach and as a visionary. He saw other people's boundaries, moral, ethical, legal, as obstacles for smaller minds. When Japan signed the Geneva Convention prohibiting biological and chemical warfare, most men saw it as a necessary limit on the cruelty of war. Ishii saw something else entirely. He reasoned that if something were bad enough to be outlawed by the world's great powers, then it must certainly be effective. And so he began a sustained, deliberate effort to build a biological weapons program for the Japanese army with human beings as the test subjects. In 1932, he got his first facility. In 1936, with the direct endorsement of Emperor Hirohito, he was given something far larger. A city, hidden in the plains of Manchuria. The finished complex consisted of 150 buildings and had the capacity to hold 600 people at any one time to be experimented on. The sign above the entrance called it an epidemic prevention unit. Inside, they were manufacturing epidemics. The prisoners arrived by special train. They came from Chinese villages, from Soviet border territories, from prisoner of war camps. Most were told they were being transferred to a work facility. Some knew they were prisoners. None of them knew what they were being transferred to. Upon arrival, they were stripped, photographed, measured. Their details were entered into a logbook, not under their name, under a number. They became subjects. They became Maruta. 3,000 Japanese researchers working at Unit 731's headquarters infected live human beings with diseases such as plague and anthrax, and then vivisected them, cut them open without anesthesia to study how the diseases had progressed through their organs. They needed live subjects because, as the researchers noted in their logs, a dead body begins to decompose immediately. The data was only useful if the organs were still functioning, so they kept them alive. Prisoners were infected with cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and bubonic plague. They were kept alive as long as possible, their deterioration carefully measured and recorded. When they were no longer useful for observation, when the disease had progressed far enough, they were taken to what staff called the dissection room. Conventional weapons tests were also carried out. Victims were tied to stakes in open fields to determine the operational range of flamethrowers, grenades, and various kinds of shells and bombs. Others were subjected to extreme cold, limbs frozen, then thawed, then frozen again to study the progression of frostbite and gangrene. Others were placed in pressure chambers. Others were suspended upside down to measure how long it took for a human being to die from the accumulation of blood in the brain. These were not the acts of rogue soldiers in the fog of war. These were controlled scientific experiments conducted by doctors, documented in research papers, with footnotes. What happened inside the facility was horrific. What happened beyond its walls was worse. Unit 731 was not only a laboratory, it was a weapons factory. Ishi's network of biological research units culminated in the experimental deployment of biological weapons on Chinese cities, a direct breach of the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas were dropped over Chinese villages. Cholera and typhoid bacteria were released into water supplies. Plague-infected rats were set loose in populated areas. The casualties from these field deployments are impossible to calculate with precision. Conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands of Chinese civilians died from Unit 731's biological weapons attacks, people who had no part in any conflict, who had no knowledge that they were being used as a testing ground, who simply woke up one morning and found their village dying around them. And the researchers took notes. Hundreds of Japanese doctors, nurses, and research scientists willingly participated in what was referred to at the time as the secret of secrets. They knew what they were doing. They knew it was illegal. They knew it was being hidden. They continued anyway, because the data was valuable, and because they believed they would never be held accountable. They were almost right. August 1945, Japan surrenders. World War II ends. Nuremberg is coming. The world has decided that crimes against humanity will be prosecuted. Shiro Ishii watched the Nuremberg doctor's trial from Japan, and then he buried his research. Literally. He had his team excavate the data, thousands of tissue slides, pathology reports, experimental results, and hide them in mountainsides, in temple grounds, in locations only he and his most trusted officers knew. Then he waited. On the 6th of May 1947, General Douglas MacArthur sent a top-secret cable to the U.S. War Department. It read, "Experiments on humans were known, confirmed by Ishii. If guaranteed immunity from war crimes, he can describe program in detail." The response from Washington came 3 months later. A combined committee of the State, War, and Navy departments issued a formal assessment. Their conclusion was recorded in a document that would remain classified for decades. The value to the U.S. of Japanese biological warfare data is of such importance to national security as to far outweigh the value accruing from war crimes prosecution. Read that sentence again. The United States government looked at what Shiro Ishii had done, the infections, the vivisections, the field deployments on civilian populations, the thousands of people who had died as logs in his research, and made a calculation. The data was worth more than the justice. The deal was made. The United States paid the equivalent of 250,000 yen for the excavation of 8,000 slides of human tissue and 60 pages of reports that Ishii had hidden. Returning American POWs, some of whom had themselves been experimented on at Unit 731, were ordered not to discuss their ordeal with anyone. Ishii became a welcome guest at Camp Detrick in Maryland, where he lectured American scientists and military personnel on the results of his human experimentations. He was not in a cell. He was in a lecture hall, describing to American researchers what he had learned from cutting open living human beings so that America could use that knowledge for its own biological weapons program. Let me tell you what happened to the men of Unit 731 after the war. Shiro Ishii returned to private life in Japan. He opened a medical clinic. He died in Tokyo in 1959, a free man, of throat cancer, at the age of 67. The vast majority of Ishii's staff walked away from their wartime service completely free. Immune from prosecution, many of Unit 731's doctors went on to prominent careers in universities, hospitals, and industry, rising to positions that included Governor of Tokyo, President of the Japanese Medical Association, and head of the Japanese Olympic Committee. The men who had performed vivisections without anesthesia, who had frozen prisoners alive, who had infected villages with plague. They became governors, association presidents, Olympic officials. The Soviet Union was the only government to bring anyone associated with Unit 731 to trial. In 1949, they convicted 12 lower-ranking Japanese military members and sentenced them to prison labor camps. 12 out of thousands. The Japanese government denied the existence of Unit 731 for decades. It was not until the 198 that Japan formally admitted it had conducted human biological warfare experiments. In 2002, a Japanese district court ruled for the first time that Japan had engaged in biological warfare. 2002, 57 years after the war ended. The victims' families have continuously been denied financial compensation. To this day, the men who were experimented on, the villagers who died in field tests, the prisoners who became Maruta, who became logs in Shiro Ishii's research, their families have received no official compensation, no formal acknowledgement from Japan, no justice of any meaningful kind. The data that was extracted from their suffering sits in American military archives, used, filed, classified. There is a detail about the Unit 731 data that history has largely forgotten. After the war, American scientists reviewed the research data obtained from Ishii in exchange for immunity. Their assessment was stark. The information turned over to the United States proved scientifically worthless. The vivisection of human beings had not yielded better scientific data than animal testing would have provided. Let that land. The United States government gave immunity to the men who had infected thousands of people with plague, who had cut open living human beings, who had frozen prisoners to death in the Manchurian winter, who had dropped biological bombs on Chinese villages. They gave them immunity for data that was worthless. Thousands of people died as logs in Shiro Ishii's laboratory. Thousands more died in his field tests. Their deaths generated data that America traded justice for and then discovered it could not use. They died for nothing. Their killers lived in freedom. Their killers became governors and doctors and Olympic officials. Their killers lectured American scientists in Maryland and then flew home to Japan and opened medical clinics and died peacefully in their beds. And the world looked away because two governments decided, in separate rooms, that it was more convenient not to know. Here is what I want you to carry with you after this video ends. Unit 731 was not hidden because it was small. It was not hidden because it was obscure. It was hidden because it was useful. And when it stopped being useful, it was hidden because it was embarrassing. The cover-up was not an accident of history. It was a policy decision, made by men in suits, in offices, with good educations and clean hands, who calculated the cost of justice against the cost of silence, and chose silence. That calculation has been made before. It will be made again. This has been Hollow Cure, the history they buried. We dig it up. Subscribe, because next week we go inside a psychology experiment that was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was shut down after 6 days, because the researchers forgot their subjects were still human beings.